Harold Morrison didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to the Double W Ranch swung open like he owned it because in his mind he already did. Ethan Walker looked up from the kitchen table where 3 months of unpaid notices sat in a pile he'd stopped counting. Morrison walked in with 2 men behind him, hat still on his head, eyes moving around the room the way a man's eyes move when he's calculating what everything is worth. "I'll make this simple," Morrison said, pulling out a chair without being invited and sitting down. "You're done, Walker. The bank's calling the note. You've got 30 days. Ethan's jaw went tight. "We had an arrangement. Arrangements change." Morrison set a folded paper on the table and slid it across with 1 finger. "Sign this and I'll forgive the debt. All of it. Clean slate." Ethan didn't touch the paper. "What is it?" "Deed transfer. The ranch comes to me. You keep the house through winter, and then you move on." Morrison leaned back like he was doing a man a favor. "It's more than fair. This land belonged to my father, and now it belongs to the bank." Morrison stood, straightened his coat. "But I'm a reasonable man, Ethan. So I've got a second option." He paused. Let the silence sit. "You marry the woman I've selected. She brings capital. Enough to clear your debt and keep you operating through next season." The room went very quiet. "Her name is Beatrice Holloway. Morrison gave a small smile that didn't reach his eyes available. "And willing, I'm told. You marry her, the debt gets restructured, the ranch stays yours. Everybody wins." Ethan stared at him. "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious when it comes to money." Morrison picked up his hat. "You've got 48 hours. He walked out the same way he walked in, like the place already belonged to him. If that scene made your blood boil, you're exactly where this story wants you. Before we go further, if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now don't go anywhere, because what Beatrice Holloway does next is going to surprise everyone, including Ethan Walker. The morning Morrison delivered his ultimatum, the temperature in Silver Creek dropped 11 degrees by noon. That was the kind of town it was. The weather matched the mood of the people in it, and the people in it had very little patience for softness. Ethan Walker had lived there his entire life. He knew every face, every fence line, every dried-up creek bed between his property and the edge of town. He'd watched his father build the Double W from raw ground and stubborn will, and he'd watched that same ground turn on him after 3 years of drought and 1 bad winter that killed 40% of his herd. He hadn't planned for his wife Clara to get sick. He hadn't planned for the medical bills, or for the way grief made a man stupid and slow with his accounts. He hadn't planned for any of it. But here he was. He sat at that kitchen table for a long time after Morrison left, the folded deed transfer sitting in front of him like something dead. Sophie was at school. She wouldn't be back until late afternoon. That gave him a few hours to figure out what a man was supposed to do when every door had closed and the only one left open led somewhere he didn't want to go. He unfolded the deed transfer and read it twice. The language was clean and simple and completely final. Morrison hadn't left any room for argument. The ranch, grazing rights, the water access, all of it, signed over. In exchange, the Walker family could live in the house until March 1st. After that, they were guests on land that used to be theirs. Folded it back up. Then he thought about Beatrice Holloway. He didn't know her well. Nobody did, exactly. She'd come to Silver Creek about 2 years back with her aunt, a quiet woman who ran a small, dry goods operation on the east end of Main Street. Beatrice helped in the shop. She was always polite, always competent, always there when the shelves needed stocking or a customer needed help finding something. She was also, and this was the part that stuck in people's minds more than anything else, large. Not just tall, not just broad. She was a big woman in a world that had very specific opinions about what women were supposed to look like. And Silver Creek had never been shy about sharing those opinions out loud. He'd heard the things people said. He'd even laughed at 1 or 2 of them years ago before he had enough trouble of his own to keep him too busy for other people's business. He wasn't proud of that. He didn't laugh now. He went to the barn and spent 2 hours doing work that didn't need doing, moving things from one place to another, just to keep his hands busy. Then he saddled his horse and rode into town. Beatrice Holloway was behind the counter of her aunt's shop when he walked in. She looked up the way she always did, steady, no expression that gave anything away. Aunt was in the back. He could hear the sound of crates being moved. "Mr. Walker," Beatrice said, "Miss Holloway." He took off his hat. He hadn't rehearsed this. "I expect you already know why I'm here." A pause. "Mr. Morrison came to see me yesterday," she said. He explained the situation. And she set down the bolt of fabric she'd been measuring. And he made it sound like a business arrangement, which I suppose it is. She looked at him directly. That was something he noticed right away. She didn't look away when most people would have. "I'm not under any illusions about what this is, Mr. Walker. You don't want to marry me. I understand that. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. I wasn't going to pretend," he said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew you weren't, that nobody forced you into this." "Nobody forced me." She said it flat and clean. "I chose it. Those are different things." He put his hat back on. "All right," he said. "Then I'll talk to Morrison." He turned to leave Mr. Walker. He stopped. "I'd ask one thing." "What's that?" "Don't take it out on your daughter," she said. "Whatever you feel about this arrangement, don't let her see it. She didn't ask for any of this either." He didn't answer. He walked out, but he thought about what she said the entire ride home. The wedding happened 9 days later in the county office, not a church. Just the two of them and 2 witnesses Morrison had arranged, which should have told Ethan something about how much control the man intended to keep even after the papers were signed. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Beatrice wore a dark green dress she'd made herself. Ethan wore his cleanest shirt. Nobody took photographs. Sophie stood in the corner of the room in the coat she'd outgrown and refused to look at Beatrice the entire time. When it was done, they rode back to the ranch in near silence. Beatrice sat beside him on the wagon seat, with her hands folded in her lap, and didn't try to fill the quiet with words. He noticed that too. Most people couldn't stand silence, filled it with noise to cover their discomfort. Beatrice just sat there and let it be quiet. Sophie went inside without a word the moment the wagon stopped. Ethan climbed down and offered his hand to help Beatrice from the wagon. She took it. Her hand was large and strong, and her grip was firm, not delicate. She stepped down and looked at the ranch, the house, the barn, the fence lines, the wide flat stretch of land going brown at the edges, and she didn't say anything about it. Not pretty, not bleak, not anything. She just looked at it the way you look at a place you're going to have to learn. "I'll make up the guest room," he said. "That'll be fine," she said. She picked up her bag herself and carried it inside. That first week was the hardest kind of quiet. Ethan kept his schedule the same. Up before dawn, barn work, fencing, whatever the ranch needed. Came in for meals because that was practical, not because he wanted company. Beatrice cooked without being asked and without announcing it, just appeared with food at the right times. Food that was plain and good and not trying to impress anyone. Sophie refused to eat at the table when Beatrice was there for the first 3 days. She took her plate to her room and closed the door. Ethan let her. He didn't have the energy to fight that battle on top of everything else. But on the 4th day, something happened that he didn't expect. He was out fixing the east fence when he heard Sophie crying. Not the kind of crying she did when she was angry or wanting something, the other kind. Quiet kind. That meant something was actually wrong. Came back to the house and found her in the kitchen, her hand wrapped in a cloth, a broken jar on the floor beside her. Beatrice was already there. She had Sophie's hand in both of hers and was looking at the cut, her voice low and steady, not alarmed, not making a fuss. "It's not deep," she was saying. "It looks worse than it is. Cuts near the fingers always bleed a lot. That's just how they work." Sophie was staring at her own hand. "It hurts." "I know it does." Beatrice reached for the tin on the shelf behind her. She'd apparently already located where things were kept and opened it without fumbling. like she'd done this kind of thing before. Hold still for me. Just for a minute. Sophie held still. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched his daughter sit quietly while a woman she'd refused to acknowledge for 4 days cleaned and wrapped her hand with the kind of calm efficiency that only came from actually knowing what you were doing, not performing care. Doing it. He went back outside. That night Sophie ate at the table. She didn't talk to Beatrice. She didn't look at her much, but she sat in her chair and ate her food, and that was more than she'd done the day before. Ethan noticed. He didn't say anything about it. Beatrice didn't say anything about it either. She didn't treat it like a victory. She just passed Sophie the bread without comment and refilled the water pitcher and asked Ethan in a plain, practical voice what the fence situation looked like on the north pasture and whether the well pump was still giving trouble. It was the first real conversation they'd had. Pump's been slow for 2 months, he said. I've been meaning to pull it and look at the valve. I can help with that, she said. I've pulled a few before. Almost said something dismissive. He caught himself. All right, he said instead. The next morning she was up before him. She had already made coffee and was standing in the barn, looking at the pump assembly with a lantern, her coat buttoned to the chin, her hair pinned back, completely unbothered by the cold. He stopped in the barn doorway and looked at her. Valve seal's cracked, she said, not looking up. You can see it if you look close. The washer's worn through on one side. Came and looked. She was right. There's a spare fitting in the back of the supply shelf, she said, behind the leather oil. He found it. He hadn't known it was there. They pulled the pump together, working in the early morning cold, without much talking, handing things back and forth when something was needed. She was strong, genuinely, practically strong, not the kind of thing people performed. When they needed to lift the pump casing to get at the valve seat, she lifted it without comment and held it steady while he worked. When it was done, she wiped her hands on a rag and said, "Should hold through spring." "Yeah," he said. "Thank you." She nodded and went back to the house. He stood there for a moment in the cold barn, the pump running smooth now, and tried to remember the last time any job on this ranch had gone that clean and simple. He couldn't. The second week brought different trouble. 2 men from Morrison's operation came out to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon while Ethan was away at the south pasture. Beatrice was alone in the house with Sophie, who was home from school with a head cold that had kept her in bed since morning. The men knocked. She opened the door. Taller one, a man with a thick mustache and a studied kind of pleasantness that didn't reach his eyes, said they were there to do a routine inspection on behalf of the bank regarding the restructured loan agreement. She asked to see the paperwork. He said there wasn't any paperwork. It was informal, just a look around. "Then you can come back when my husband is here," she said. "Ma'am, it'd be simpler if I'm sure it would be simpler," she said. "Come back when my husband is here." She closed the door. She heard them talking outside for a minute. Then she heard them leave. She went back to Sophie's room, where the girl was watching her from the bed with dark eyes over the blanket. "Who were those men?" Sophie asked. "Nobody important," Beatrice said. She sat down in the chair beside the bed and picked up the cloth she'd been using to keep Sophie's forehead cool. "How's your head?" Sophie thought about it. "Still hurts. Do you want some broth?" "The chicken's been on the stove since morning. It should be ready." Pause. "Okay," Sophie said. Beatrice went to get it. When she came back with the bowl, Sophie was sitting up in bed, watching her again with that careful look. "You're not scared of them," Sophie said. "Who?" "Those men." Beatrice set the bowl on the small table beside the bed. "People like that are only useful if you're afraid of them," she said. "So I didn't see much point in being afraid." Sophie looked at the bowl. Then she looked at Beatrice. "My mama used to make broth like this when I was sick." The room got very quiet. Beatrice didn't say anything right away. She didn't rush to fill the space. She just let the girl's words sit there between them and breathe. "She sounds like she knew how to take care of people," Beatrice said finally. Sophie nodded. Her eyes had gone a little bright. She was good at it. "Then she taught you something important," Beatrice said, even if she didn't mean to. You know what it feels like to be taken care of. That's not something everyone knows. Sophie picked up the bowl and held it in both hands. She didn't say anything else. But she didn't ask Beatrice to leave either. When Ethan came in that evening and heard about the men from Morrison's office, something in his face went tight and dangerous. He didn't say much about it, but Beatrice watched him file it away, the way a man files something away when he's building a case in his own mind. They had no business coming out here, he said. No, she agreed. They didn't. You handled it right. I know, she said. He looked at her then. Not the glancing look she'd gotten most of the past 2 weeks, a real look, the kind that lasted more than a second. She held it without flinching. He was the one who looked away first, and for some reason that felt significant, though neither of them said a word about it. That night, after Sophie was in bed, and the house was quiet, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the restructured loan agreement Morrison had given him and spread it out under the lamp. He'd read it before. He read it again now. There was something in the language on page 4 that hadn't bothered him the first time through, but was bothering him now. Clause about what happened to the grazing rights in the event of a change in the primary residential arrangement. It was buried in the middle of a paragraph about payment schedules, the kind of language you'd skip over if you weren't looking for it. He wasn't sure what it meant, but it didn't sit right. He left it on the table and went to bed. In the morning, before he was up, he came out to find Beatrice sitting at that same table with the loan agreement in front of her, a cup of coffee beside her, reading it with the same careful, unhurried attention she gave to everything. She didn't look up when he walked in. This clause on page 4, she said. Did Morrison explain it to you? No, he said. He wouldn't, she said, because if he explained it, you'd know what it does. Ethan poured himself coffee and sat down. And what does it do? She looked up then. Her expression was even, but there was something underneath it, not anger exactly, more like the calm that comes just before someone decides to fight. Gives him the right to void the entire restructured agreement if we stop living here as a married couple, she said. Sounds reasonable on the surface. But the definition of change in primary residential arrangement is broad enough that if I left for any reason, sickness, family, anything he could argue, the condition was violated. And the minute he voids the agreement, the original debt comes due in full. Immediately. Ethan stared at her. He built in a way to take the ranch, no matter what. He built in several, she said. This is just the one on page 4. The silence that followed was the kind that changes something. Ethan folded the loan agreement and set it on the shelf above the fireplace, behind the tin where he kept the ranch's old deed. Put it there deliberately, where he'd see it every time he walked past, so he wouldn't forget what it meant. Beatrice watched him do it without comment. She understood the gesture. Some things needed to stay visible so they didn't get buried under the dailiness of just trying to keep going. The days that followed had a different weight to them. Not heavier, exactly, but more loaded, the way air gets before a storm that hasn't decided yet whether it's coming. Ethan went about his work the same as always up before light, barn first, then whatever the land needed, but something in how he moved through the ranch had shifted. He was paying attention in a different way now, watching for things he used to walk past. Beatrice noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. She had her own way of working through a problem, which was to keep her hands busy and let her mind run underneath. She reorganized the kitchen stores that second week, not because they were disorganized, but because going through them told her what the ranch actually had versus what it looked like it had. There was a difference. The pantry looked sparse, but was more functional than it appeared once you moved things around. The root cellar had been poorly stocked before winter set in. Whoever had managed it last hadn't planned ahead, or hadn't had the means to. She took inventory and wrote it down in the small notebook she carried in her coat pocket. She did the same with the barn, walking through it with a lantern one evening after supper while Ethan was still out checking the water troughs. She looked at the equipment, the harness condition, what was mended, and what had been left to wait. Quite a bit had been left to wait. Not from laziness, she could tell the difference between a man who didn't care and a man who was overwhelmed. Ethan was overwhelmed. Had been for a while. Some of the wear on that equipment went back further than the last few months. It went back to before Clara died, which told her the trouble on this ranch had been building longer than anyone knew. She was making a note about the wagon axle when she heard him come in behind her. "Doing," he said. Not hostile. Just flat. "Looking at what needs doing," she said. "I know what needs doing. I know you do." She closed the notebook. But two sets of eyes sometimes catch different things. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the wagon. "Axle's been on my list." "The grease fitting on the left wheel is cracked," she said. "The whole thing could go if you load it heavy." He walked over and crouched beside the wheel, ran his hand along the fitting. He didn't say she was right, but he didn't say she was wrong either. He stood up and pulled off his gloves and slapped them against his thigh. "I'll get to it this week. I can help." He looked at her again. The look was shorter this time, less guarded. "You said that about the pump too." "And the pump's running," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but something slightly less closed. Pulled his gloves back on and went past her toward the back of the barn without answering. She took that for what it was and went back to the house. The problem with Morrison's clause didn't leave her thoughts. She'd read contracts before her father had been a man who dealt in land agreements and small loans out in eastern Kansas. And he'd made a point of teaching her to read the language the way a doctor reads symptoms, looking for what was hidden underneath the surface presentation. Morrison was good. She'd give him that. The clause was buried in unremarkable language and positioned between two paragraphs that were boring enough to make your eyes slide past. Most men would have missed it. Ethan had missed it. She would have missed it herself if she hadn't been looking for exactly that kind of construction. She wrote down the specific language in her notebook and underlined two phrases: change in primary residential arrangement and at the sole discretion of the lender. That second phrase was the real problem. It meant Morrison didn't need a legal argument to invoke the clause. He just needed a reason he was willing to state out loud. He could make one up. Probably, and by the time anyone challenged it in front of a judge, the original debt would already be called due, and there'd be nothing left to fight over. She needed to understand how many times he'd used this same structure. She thought about who might know that. On Thursday morning, she asked Ethan if she could take the small wagon into town. He said yes without asking why, which she appreciated. She went to the county records office first, which was a single room off the back of the courthouse, staffed by a narrow, precise man named Gerald, who smelled like pipe tobacco and kept his files in meticulous order. She asked to look at land transfer records from the past 6 years. Gerald seemed mildly surprised by the request but had no reason to refuse it, so he brought out the ledgers and left her alone. She spent 2 hours with those ledgers. What she found was not a pattern so much as a signature. Morrison's name appeared 18 times in land transfer records over 6 years. 12 of those transfers had involved properties that had previously carried restructured debt agreements with the Silver Creek Savings and Loan, which was Morrison's institution. Of those 12, 9 had transferred to Morrison's personal holding company within 18 months of the restructuring. The remaining 3 had transferred to other buyers, but in each case the sale price was dramatically below assessed value, which suggested distressed sale conditions, meaning the original owners had been pushed to sell fast, under pressure. He'd been doing this for years, systematically. The Double W was not a target of opportunity. It was just next in line. She closed the ledger and sat with that for a moment. Then she asked Gerald if he could point her toward any records of legal challenges to those transfers. There had been 2. Both had been dismissed. Both dismissals had come from the same circuit judge, a man named Alderman Fitch, who, according to the county directory sitting on Gerald's desk, was a member of the Silver Creek Merchant and Commerce Association, an organization whose board membership list included the name Harold Morrison. She wrote that down too. On the ride back to the ranch, She passed the dry goods store where her aunt worked and stopped the wagon. Aunt Frances was a small, uneasy, sharp-eyed woman of 60 who had come west after her husband died and built a quiet life for herself through sheer practical stubbornness. Beatrice had lived with her for 2 years, and Frances knew her well enough to read her face the moment she walked in. "Sit down," Frances said. "I'll put water on." Beatrice sat. She told her aunt what she'd found, keeping her voice low even though they were alone in the shop. Frances listened without interrupting, which was one of her better qualities. When Beatrice finished, Frances was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This isn't going to end with a judge." "No," Beatrice agreed. "You know what Morrison will do if he thinks you're looking into him." "But I know. Does Ethan know what you found today?" Beatrice wrapped both hands around her cup. "Not yet." Frances looked at her steadily. "You should tell him." "I will," she paused. "I just need to think about how." She got back to the ranch before dark. Ethan was at the table going through his accounts, which she had come to understand was something he did when he was feeling the pressure of things he couldn't fix. He'd spread the same papers out 3 times since she'd arrived and put them away without reaching any new conclusions. She set down her coat and her bag and sat down across from him. "I went to the county records office today," she said. He looked up. She told him what she'd found. All of it. She laid it out the way her father had taught her: facts first, implications second, questions last. She didn't editorialize, and she didn't soften it. She told him that the Double W wasn't the first ranch Morrison had taken through this method, that he'd done it at least 9 times over 6 years, that the legal system in Silver Creek had already shown it wouldn't help, and that whatever they were going to do about it, they were going to have to do it themselves. Ethan sat very still while she talked. His hands were flat on the table. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. 9 properties, he said finally. "That I could find in public records," she said. "There may be more that didn't go through a formal transfer, and the judge is in his pocket, connected to him at minimum." Ethan pushed back from the table and stood up. He walked to the window and stood there looking out at the dark yard. Could see the set of his shoulders, the particular tension that lived between his shoulder blades when he was trying to contain something. She'd been watching him long enough now to read a few of those signals. "I should have looked closer," he said. "You were managing a grief and a failing ranch at the same time," she said. "Most men don't read loan agreements carefully, even when they're not doing either of those things." Turned around. "That's generous. It's accurate," she said. "This isn't about what you missed. It's about what we do from here." He looked at her. "We," he said. "Yes." Another silence. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking we need to find the other families, the ones who lost their property to him. If they're willing to talk, and if the stories are consistent enough, we might be able to build something a circuit judge from outside, this county, would have to take seriously. Morrison's influence stops at the county line." "That's a long road," Ethan said. "It is," she agreed. "But it's the only one I can see that doesn't end with us losing the ranch anyway." He came back to the table and sat down. He was quiet for another moment, and then he said something that surprised her. "How do you know how to do all this? The contracts, the records. Where did that come from?" She looked at her hands. "My father dealt in land agreements, small ones mostly. He lost everything to a bad contract when I was 12. She paused. "He always said the worst part wasn't losing the land. It was that he hadn't known what he was signing. So he taught me to read everything, every word, even the boring parts." "Especially the boring parts," Ethan said quietly. "Especially those." He picked up the loan agreement from the table and looked at it for a moment, then set it down. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need." That was the beginning of something different between them. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but a kind of working partnership that had its own weight and its own rules. They started spending evenings at the kitchen table together, going over what Beatrice had found and thinking through next steps. Ethan knew the county in a way she didn't. He knew which families had lost land, knew their names, knew the rough shape of their situations, and she knew how to organize that knowledge into something useful. his manner with her changed by small degrees. He started telling her things in the morning, before he went out, what he planned to do that day, what he needed, not asking, exactly, but including her. She worked alongside him when the work allowed it, and when it didn't, she worked separately, without making it an issue. She was not the kind of person who needed to be thanked for every contribution. That was good, because Ethan was not naturally a man who handed out thanks easily. Sophie watched all of this from a careful distance. The girl was 10 years old and sharper than most adults gave her credit for. She had her father's tendency to go quiet when she was working something out, and her mother's ways of noticing things people didn't say. She watched Beatrice the way you watch a thing you haven't decided about yet, trying to figure out what category it belonged in. She didn't stop eating at the table. She started asking small questions, not to Beatrice directly, not at first, but near her. Questions addressed to the room, which Beatrice answered, without making a production of it. What's that plant you put in the broth? Why do you write in that notebook? How come you're not cold when you're working in the barn? I'm cold, Beatrice said the third time. I just don't see the point in mentioning it. Sophie thought about that. My dad does that too, she said. It's a useful habit, Beatrice said. Sophie went back to her homework, but a few minutes later, she asked, unprompted, whether Beatrice thought the axle on the small wagon was going to hold until spring. Ethan, sitting across the table, looked up from his papers and looked at his daughter, and then looked at Beatrice with an expression that was the closest thing to surprised amusement she'd seen from him. Probably, Beatrice said, if we're not foolish with the load. Sophie nodded seriously, like that was an answer worth having. The trouble came on a Friday afternoon in the 4th week. One of the neighboring ranchers, a man named Chet Briggs, who ran a smaller operation about 4 miles east, rode up to the Double W in a state of controlled agitation. Ethan was fixing fence on the north side, and Beatrice was the one who came out of the barn when she heard the horse. Briggs pulled up short when he saw her, clearly expecting Ethan. Is Walker around? He said. He's on the north fence, she said. I can get him or take a message. Briggs looked at her for a moment, visibly deciding. Then he got down from his horse, which she took as a sign he'd chosen to trust her with whatever it was. Morrison's men went through the Halverson place yesterday, he said. Tom Halverson, east of me. They showed up with some kind of notice from the bank and took his equipment. Just loaded it up and took it. Tom didn't know he was behind on anything. He'd made his last payment 3 weeks ago. She kept her expression even. Did Tom get a copy of the notice? They wouldn't give him one. Said it was a bank document, not his to keep. She looked at Briggs steadily. How many of the other ranchers in this area carried debt through Morrison's bank? Briggs put his hand on the back of his neck and looked at the ground. Most of them, he said. There's not another option in this county. The nearest outside bank is in Fort Junction, 2 days' ride. Would Tom Halverson be willing to talk to me? Briggs looked at her again. About what exactly? About what his agreement with Morrison says. Word for word. He took off his hat and held it. What are you thinking, Mrs. Walker? I'm thinking Tom Halverson is not the first person Morrison has done this to, she said. And if enough of the people he's done it to are willing to talk about it, the story gets harder to keep quiet. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hat back on. Talk to Tom, he said. Can't promise anything. That's all I'm asking. She sent word to Ethan through one of the ranch hands, and then went back inside and sat at the table with her notebook and started writing out what she knew in order. Not a list, a sequence. The kind of document that showed not just individual actions, but a pattern of deliberate intent. She was still writing when Ethan came. In an hour later, boots loud on the floorboards, clearly having pushed his horse hard from the north fence. Briggs told me, he said. I know, she said. Sit down. He sat down. Morrison's moving faster, she said. The Halverson situation means he's not waiting for agreements to run their course anymore. He's creating defaults where they don't exist. That means he's either feeling pressure from somewhere, or he's decided to accelerate his timeline, for a reason we don't know about yet. Either way, it means we have less time, Ethan said. Yes, how much less? I don't know, she said honestly, but I don't think we can count on the full term of the restructuring agreement. We need to work as if we have weeks, not months. Ethan put his hands flat on the table the same way he'd done the night she told him about the county records. It was a thing he did when he was settling himself, getting ready to carry something. The other families, he said, the ones Morrison took before us. Do you know where they are? I have names from the records, she said, addresses I'd have to find. I know where some of them ended up, he said. There's a man named Hector Ruiz who used to run a cattle operation north of here. Lost it 3 years back. He's working as a hired hand now on the Caldwell spread. And the Benton widow, her name, is Margaret. She's in town, running a boarding house on the south end of Maine. Beatrice looked at him. You knew about them. I knew their situations, he said. I didn't know they were connected to each other. Will they talk to us? He thought about it. Hector might. He's a straight-talking man. Always was. Margaret Benton. He paused. She's got less reason to trust anyone. She lost that land right after her husband died. Morrison moved on her inside of 90 days. Then I'll go to Hector first, Beatrice said. If he's willing to talk, that gives us something to bring to Margaret. I'll come with you, Ethan said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He looked at her directly. I want to. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and went back to her notebook. They rode out the following morning, the two of them on horseback. Ethan setting a moderate pace that accounted for the cold without making a fuss about it. The Caldwell spread was an hour northeast, a larger operation that ran mostly sheep and looked at. Everything was close-cropped and orderly in a way cattle ranches rarely were. Ethan asked for Hector at the main barn, and a young hand went to find him. Hector Ruiz was a compact, weathered man in his 50s, with a face that had seen more weather than shelter. Came out of the barn with his hat in his hands and shook Ethan's hand. And then he looked at Beatrice with the careful attention of a man who'd learned not to judge a first impression, but hadn't stopped making them. This is my wife, Ethan said. Beatrice? Ma'am, Hector said. Thank you for seeing us, she said. I'll come straight to the point if that's all right with you. Always preferred it, he said. She told him what she'd found in the county records. His face as she talked went through several different arrangements, none of them comfortable. When she finished, he was quiet for a while, looking at the ground. Always thought it was just me, he said finally, that I'd done something wrong with the numbers. You didn't, she said. The structure of the agreement was designed to fail. You couldn't have caught it without knowing what you were looking for. He looked at her. Then he looked at Ethan. She always like this? Pretty much, Ethan said. Hector turned his hat in his hands. What do you need from me? Yours, she said. In writing, if you're willing. What your agreement said. What happened. In what order. The more specific, the better. Dates. Amounts. What Morrison's men said to you. All of it. And then what? And then we take it somewhere outside this county, she said, where the name Harold Morrison's means nothing to anyone. Hector was quiet for another long moment. A crow landed on the fence post behind him and looked at all three of them and flew away. He's got a long reach, Hector said. He does, she agreed. But a long reach only works if people are standing close enough to feel it. He looked at her one more time, and something in his expression settled into something that looked like decision. Give me 2 days, he said. I'll write it down. They rode back to the Double W with the cold at their backs and a thin gray sky overhead. Ethan was quiet for most of the ride, which she'd come to understand meant he was thinking, not withdrawing. When the ranch came into view, he pulled his horse up slightly, and she slowed to match him. You gave him back something today, Ethan said. She looked over. What do you mean? He thought it was his fault, Ethan said, that he'd failed somehow. You told him it wasn't true. He paused. That matters. Whether it helps us or not, that mattered to him. She looked at the ranch ahead of them. The smoke from the chimney was going straight up in the still air. Sophie would be home from school by now. My father thought it was his fault, too, she said, for 20 years. Ethan didn't say anything to that, but he didn't look away either. They rode in together, and for the first time since the wedding, It felt like they were riding in from the same direction. That evening, Sophie was at the table, working on a drawing she wouldn't let either of them see. She kept her arm curved around it whenever one of them walked past, which was its own kind of telling. Ethan glanced at Beatrice over Sophie's head, and Beatrice gave the smallest shrug, meaning leave it alone, and he did. After supper, Sophie went to her room. Beatrice cleaned up and Ethan banked the fire, and they fell into the easy, slightly tired rhythm of two people who have done a hard day's work and know it. She was putting away the last of the dishes when Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, holding the drawing fess out. It was the ranch, the barn, the fence line, the house, and in front of the house, three figures, one tall, one medium, one small. The medium one had dark hair and a coat. "It's not very good," Sophie said, studying her own drawing with the critical eye of someone who expected more from themselves. "It looks like the ranch," Beatrice said. "I couldn't get the barn right. Fence looks right," Beatrice said. "That's the hardest part." Sophie looked at her. "Really? All those straight lines," Beatrice said. "Hard to keep them straight across a whole page." Sophie looked at the drawing again, reconsidering it. Then she went to bed without saying anything else, leaving the drawing on the kitchen table. Ethan looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Beatrice, and this time neither of them looked away first. Sophie's drawing stayed on the kitchen table for 3 days, before anyone moved it. Beatrice set it against the wall beside the window where the light hit it in the morning, which was not a decision, she announced or explained. Just there. When Ethan came down the second morning, propped up where Sophie could see it from her chair at breakfast. Sophie noticed. She didn't say anything, but she sat down that morning and ate her eggs without looking at her plate the way she usually did. And Ethan caught her glancing at the drawing twice. Small things. But the ranch ran on small things. Hector Ruiz came through 2 days after their visit, as he'd promised. He rode up on a borrowed horse in the late afternoon, with a folded letter in his coat pocket, and the look of a man who'd spent time deciding something and wasn't going back on it. Beatrice was the one who met him at the door. She read the letter while he stood in the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee Ethan had poured him, and what Hector had written was careful and specific and worth more than she'd hoped. He'd remembered dates. He'd kept a payment receipt that contradicted the default notice Morrison's men had given him. He'd written it all down in plain working language that didn't try to sound like anything other than what it was a man. Saying what happened to him, in order without decoration. "This is good," she told him. "It's just what I remember," he said. "That's exactly what it needs to be." Ethan shook his hand when he left and said something low that Beatrice didn't catch. Hector nodded, put his hat on, and rode back the way he came. She watched him go from the window and thought about her father again. The way he'd carried the weight of a thing that hadn't been his fault for so long it had bent him. She hoped Hector wouldn't carry it that way. She thought he might be the kind of man who wouldn't. She added his letter to the folder she'd been building, Hector's account, her notes from the county records, the transcribed language from Morrison's loan agreement, the names and rough details of the 9 properties she'd traced. It wasn't enough yet. A folder full of records and one man's letter was a beginning, not a case. She needed Margaret Benton, and she needed at least 2 or 3 more voices before she could take anything to anyone worth taking it to. She told Ethan that night. "Margaret's not going to be easy," he said. He was at the table with his coffee, which was cold because he'd forgotten to drink it. "She doesn't trust people. Didn't before she lost the land, and she'd have less reason now. Will she know who I am?" He considered it. "She'll know you married me. Whether that helps or hurts, I can't say. Does she know you? We were friendly enough. She and her husband James used to come to the Harvest Social." He paused. "James died in the spring before she lost the land. Morrison gave her 60 days before he moved on the note. She had 2 kids and a sister who helped her. They all left Silver Creek after. Still here, running a boarding house. She came back about a year later," Ethan said. "I don't know why. Maybe she needed to see it through somehow. Margaret was always stubborn that way." Beatrice looked at her folder. I'll go to her alone. Ethan frowned. Why alone? Because she lost her land right after she lost her husband. Beatrice said, if a man comes with me, the first thing she's going to see is a man who still has his ranch. It's not a good way to start. He sat with that. You're probably right. I usually am about this kind of thing, she said, not with any edge, just factually. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd gotten. She went to the boarding house on Tuesday morning, while Ethan took Sophie to school. The building was on the south end of Main Street, a narrow 3-story house that had been painted at some point and was overdue for another coat. A small sign near the door said Benton House, clean curtains in the windows, swept porch. Someone cared about the place even if the place had seen better years. Margaret Benton answered the door herself. She was a lean woman in her mid-40s, with gray threading through her brown hair, and a way of standing in a doorway that said she'd decided, before she opened the door, whether she wanted to talk to whoever was on the other side. She looked at Beatrice for a moment with eyes that were tired but not dull. Mrs. Walker, she said. Mrs. Benton. Thank you for answering the door. I always answer the door, Margaret said. It's a boarding house. She stood aside to let Beatrice in. The front room was clean and plain, furnished with the deliberate practicality of someone who'd had to think hard about every piece she kept. Margaret led her to a small sitting room off the hall and gestured at a chair. I know why you're here, Margaret said, before Beatrice had settled. Word gets around in a town this size. Then I don't need to explain. You can explain anyway, Margaret said. I want to hear how you put it, Beatrice told her. She used the same approach she'd used with Hector facts, then implications, then questions. She laid out what she'd found in the county records, Hector's account, the structure of Morrison's agreements, and how they were designed to give him an exit regardless of whether the borrower paid or defaulted. She did not mention that she had a personal stake in stopping Morrison. She didn't think Margaret needed reminding of that. When she finished, Margaret was quiet for a while. She had her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at the middle distance with the look of a woman running arithmetic in her head. He moved on my note in 61 days, Margaret said. James had been dead 7 weeks. I'd made 2 payments on time. The third payment was 3 days late because I couldn't get to the bank before it closed. I had a sick child. The weather had been bad. The roads where she stopped. Her jaw tightened. He sent men the following week with a formal demand notice. I tried to contest it. Judge Fitch dismissed it in under 20 minutes. I know about Judge Fitch, Beatrice said. Then you know what we're dealing with. Yes. Margaret looked at her directly. What exactly do you think you can do about this? Morrison has owned this town for years. Careful. He's connected. And the people he's hurt are scattered and broke and trying to keep their heads above water. That's true, Beatrice said. But there's a federal land court in Denver that doesn't fall under county jurisdiction. Federal circuit that Judge Fitch has no influence over. If we can document a pattern of fraudulent loan manipulation across multiple properties, the same language, the same methods, the same outcome, we have something a federal examiner has to look at. Morrison's influence stops at the county line. Getting to Denver takes money and time and evidence. I have the evidence, Beatrice said. I'm working on the rest. Margaret studied her for a long moment. What do you need from me? Your account, Beatrice said in writing. Whatever you have, payment records, the demand notice, anything, permission to use your name. Margaret's expression tightened at the last part. That's the part that costs something, she said. I know. If Morrison finds out I'm involved before you've got a federal case built, he'll make trouble for this boarding house. Got 4 tenants. I've got 2 kids who are finally stable. I've got a life that barely holds together as it is. I understand, Beatrice said. She meant it, do you? Margaret's voice wasn't hostile. It was genuinely asking. Beatrice thought about what to say. She could have made promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Didn't. I understand that you have more to lose than I do, she said. I'm asking you to trust me with that, and I can't guarantee I'll protect it perfectly. I can tell you I won't waste it, And I can tell you that if you don't join this and Morrison keeps going, the next person he takes from will have even less to fight back with. The room was quiet. Somewhere above them, a floorboard creaked a tenant moving around upstairs. "Leave me your address," Margaret said finally. "I'll send word in a few days." Beatrice stood, thanked her, and left. She didn't know what Margaret would decide. She walked back to the wagon and sat for a moment before picking up the reins. The town was doing its regular mid-morning business around her. A wagon going past, two women on the boardwalk in front of the dry goods store, a dog trotting through the mud near the feed merchant. Silver Creek had a way of looking completely ordinary, even when something was eating it from the inside. She drove home. The trouble she hadn't accounted for came from a direction she should have anticipated, but hadn't. It started with a man named Dale Pruitt. Pruitt was one of Morrison's regular contractors, not an employee exactly, but the kind of man who made himself useful to people with power and got paid in favors and small cash arrangements. He was in his late 30s, tall, with a permanent air of someone who knew which way the wind was blowing and had positioned himself accordingly. He'd done a few things for Morrison over the years that Beatrice suspected fell outside what you'd want written down. But she hadn't thought he was a threat in any direct sense. He was a follower, not an initiator. She was wrong about that. Pruitt had apparently been watching the comings and goings at the Double W with more attention than she'd realized. He showed up at the ranch on a Thursday morning when Ethan was in town picking up supplies and Beatrice was working in the barn. She heard boots on the barn floor and looked up expecting Ethan and found Pruitt instead, standing in the entrance with his hands in his coat pockets and a smile that was doing a lot of work trying to look friendly. "Mrs. Walker," he said. She set down the harness she'd been working on. Pruitt. "Nice to see you settling in," he said, looking around the barn with the same evaluating look Morrison's men had used. "Place looks better kept than I'd have expected, considering." "Considering what?" she said. He smiled wider, like she'd said something clever. Just a figure of speech. "I was hoping to have a word with your husband. He's not here, I can see that." He didn't move toward the door. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Walker. I've heard some things about conversations you've been having around the county, about certain business arrangements, certain records." She looked at him steadily. "Have you?" "Word travels," he said. "You know how it is." He shifted his weight. "I think it'd be better for everyone if those conversations stayed informal, private. I think you're a smart woman, and I think you understand that some things are better left alone. Are you delivering a message or your own opinion?" she said. Something flickered behind his eyes. "Does it matter?" "It matters," she said. "Because if you're delivering a message, I'll know exactly who thought this conversation was necessary." The friendly expression slipped a little. Just a little. "I'd take this seriously, Mrs. Walker." "I am taking it seriously," she said. "That's why I'm asking you to leave my property." He stood there for another few seconds, just long enough to make a point of it. Then he turned and walked out. She went to the barn door and watched him ride away, her hands loose at her sides. Her heartbeat elevated in the way it got when something happened that changed the shape of a situation. Morrison knew she was looking into him. That changed the timeline. That changed everything. She was at the kitchen table, writing, when Ethan got back. Came in with supplies and read her face before he'd even set the bags down. "What happened?" he said. She told him about Pruitt. Ethan set the bags on the counter with more force than was necessary. "He came here. Yes, while I was gone. That was probably intentional," she said. "He wanted to talk to me without you here. Ethan's jaw was doing the thing it did." "That's it means. Morrison is aware of what I've been doing," she said, keeping her voice level because one of them needed to. "It means we've lost the advantage of him not knowing. It also means we need to move faster." He turned from the counter. "How much faster?" "I'm going back to the county records tomorrow to copy the transfer documents before anything gets altered. I need you to ride to the Caldwell spread and ask Hector if he's willing to make a formal statement. And if Margaret Benton sends word, we go to her immediately." "You think Morrison would touch the county records?" "I think Morrison would touch Whatever gave him an advantage, she said. I've seen how he works. I'm not going to underestimate him. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. What about Sophie? She looked at him. He was asking the right question, which meant he was thinking clearly despite the anger. Can she stay with your neighbor? The Briggs family? Ruth Briggs would take her, he said. No questions. Then let's do that, starting tomorrow. Sophie, when she was told she'd be spending some days with the Briggs family, looked between her father and Beatrice with the sharp attention she brought to things she sensed. Adults weren't fully explaining. Is something wrong? She asked. We've got some business to sort out, Ethan said. Sophie looked at Beatrice. Beatrice held the girl's gaze. It may be a little complicated for a while, she said. The Briggs have that mare that just foaled. Ruth said you could help with the feeding. Sophie was 10, and she wasn't fooled by the redirection, but she also wasn't immune to the idea of a foal. Okay, she said, but I want to know when it's over. You'll know, Beatrice said. It was a promise she wasn't certain she could keep either, but she made it because Sophie needed to hear it, and because Beatrice had learned early that children forgave you for not knowing the future better than they forgave you for pretending you did. County Records Office was the same as before Gerald, with his pipe smell, the rows of ledgers, the single high window letting in weak winter light. Beatrice asked for the same records she'd looked at before and settled in with paper and pen to copy the key transfer documents in full. It took 3 hours. Gerald came and went twice and looked at her both times with something between curiosity and mild professional concern. But he didn't interrupt. But what she found on her second pass through the records was something she'd missed the first time. Transfer that wasn't in the same ledger as the others. A smaller property, less than 200 acres, transferred 18 months earlier under different terms. The borrower's name was a woman named Vera Caswell. The agreement had the same clause structure as Ethan's, the same buried language about residential arrangements, the same broad default definition. But what was different was that the transfer had been challenged. There was a notation in the margin, small and cramped, that said the challenge had been withdrawn. She wrote down Vera Caswell's name. When she got back to the ranch that evening, Ethan was already home. He'd been to Hector, who was willing to make a formal statement. He'd also heard something in town that he told her about before she'd even taken her coat off. Morrison filed a new notice with the county assessor's office this afternoon. He said, property inspection request for the W. She stopped with her coat half off. On what grounds? Unclear, he said. The language as Gerald at the records office said it was unusual. He'd never seen that particular form used for a residential working ranch. Beatrice finished taking her coat off and hung it on the peg. She thought about what that meant. Property inspection from the county assessor could be used to establish grounds for reassessment of the ranch's value, which could in turn affect the terms of the restructured loan, which could give Morrison a technical basis for calling the debt. It was a reach, legally. But a reach was all he needed if Judge Fitch was the one deciding whether it was valid. When is the inspection scheduled? She said. 2 weeks. Then we have 2 weeks. Ethan looked at her. To do what exactly? To have something in front of a federal examiner before the inspection results can be used against us. She moved to the table and opened her folder. I need to find Vera Caswell, and I need to know why she withdrew her challenge. You found another one this afternoon. She showed him the notation. If she withdrew under pressure, that's another piece. If she withdrew because she was paid off or threatened, that's a much bigger piece. He looked at the notation and then at her. How are you going to find her? The transfer record shows an address in Fort Junction, she said. 2 days' ride. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. I'll go with you, he said. The ranch can manage 2 days, he said. Tom Riley can watch things. He's done it before. She looked at him. He was not a man who offered things he hadn't thought through. All right, she said. They rode out before dawn. 2 mornings later, Ethan on his horse and Beatrice on the smaller roan, moving through the early dark, with the cold sharp enough to sting the eyes and a sky full of stars going gray at the eastern edge. It was the first time they'd traveled any real distance together, and the first hour was mostly quiet. The way travel in the dark often is there's not much to say when you can barely see the road and you're both just trying to stay warm. But by the time the light was full up and the country had opened out into the wider flat of the eastern range, they were talking. Not about Morrison, not about the case, about the land. He knew this territory, the way people knew things they'd grown up inside, of not just what it looked like, but what it meant. Which draws ran water in dry years, and which dried up first, where the soil changed character, where the grass held, and where it gave out. She listened and asked questions that surprised him a little. She could tell, because they were the questions of someone who actually understood what he was describing. "Where'd you learn to read land?" he asked. "From my father," she said. "Before he lost everything, he was good at it. And after?" She thought about it. After, he was still good at it. He just didn't have any land left to read. Ethan was quiet for a while. "I'm sorry," he said. "So was he," she said. But being sorry didn't fix anything. So eventually he stopped being sorry and just taught me everything he knew, because that was something he could still do. Ethan looked at the horizon. "That's a hard kind of gift to give a child. It's the kind that lasts," she said. They made Fort Junction by evening, found the boarding house the county record had listed as Vera Caswell's address, and were told she no longer lived there. The woman at the desk, a broad, unhurried woman named Hattie, said Vera had moved out about a year ago to a small place on the north edge of town. She gave them directions without asking why they wanted to know, which Beatrice appreciated. Vera Caswell was not what she'd expected. She was a young woman, mid-20s at most, with a direct gaze and the wariness of someone who'd been caught off guard by life enough times to stop relaxing in between. She answered the door of the small rented house herself, looked at Ethan and Beatrice on her step, and said, "Whatever you're selling, I'm not interested." "We're not selling anything," Beatrice said. "My name is Beatrice Walker. My husband and I have a ranch in Silver Creek. Harold Morrison holds our debt." Something changed in Vera's expression. Not warmth, but the particular sharpening of attention that happens when someone hears a name they've been trying not to think about. "You'd better come in," she said. Vera's place was small and cold and very tidy. She put water on without asking if they wanted any, and then turned and leaned against the kitchen counter, with her arms crossed, and looked at both of them. "He threatened you," Beatrice said. It was a statement, not a question. Vera's jaw moved. "He sent a man. Said if I pursued the challenge, he'd find a way to make sure I never got credit in any bank in the territory again. I had a younger brother I was supporting. I didn't have the resources to fight, and I couldn't risk his future on a challenge I wasn't sure I could win." She paused. "So I withdrew." "Would you be willing to say that in a statement?" Beatrice said. "To who?" "To a federal examiner, not a county judge. Not anyone in Silver Creek." Vera looked at her steadily. "You've built something." "I'm building something," Beatrice said. "It's not done." The young woman was quiet for a long time. She looked at her hands, which were clasped together in front of her. Then she looked up. "If I sign something, and Morrison finds out before it gets to a federal level, I'm finished." "It's a real risk," Beatrice said. "I won't tell you it isn't. But if I don't sign something," Vera said slowly, "and nothing changes, then the next woman in my position has the same choice and the same nothing." "Yes," Beatrice said. Vera uncrossed her arms. "I'll write a statement. Tonight, if you'll wait." They waited. It was nearly 9 o'clock when they left Vera's house with a sealed letter in Beatrice's saddlebag. The night was clear and bitter cold, and they walked the horses slowly toward the boarding house where they'd arranged to stay. 4 accounts now," Ethan said. 5. "If Margaret Benton comes through," she said. "Is it enough?" She thought about it honestly. "It should be enough to get a federal examiner to look at it. Whether he does anything with what he finds, that depends on things I can't control." "You've controlled plenty that most people couldn't," he said. She looked over at him. He wasn't looking at her, he was watching the road ahead, which was his usual way, but the statement had been deliberate. "I'm trying to fix something that shouldn't have needed fixing," she said. That's different from being in control of it. He nodded once. Then after a moment, thank you. For all of it. For what you found and what you've done with it. I'm not good at saying things like that, but I wanted you to know I see it. Cold was deep around them, and the stars were very clear. She looked at the road ahead and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel on the double W, not peace exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had weight without being heavy. I know you see it, she said. They rode in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than the ones before it, kind that had room in it rather than walls. They got back to Silver Creek the following evening, cold and stiff from the ride, but with the folder heavier and the picture clearer. Tom Riley met them at the barn with news that Margaret Benton had sent word to the ranch that morning, a sealed envelope left with Tom without explanation. Beatrice opened it while Ethan unsaddled the horses. Inside was a 3-page handwritten account, dates and details, and a payment receipt with Morrison's bank stamp on it, and at the bottom, in Margaret's careful hand, her full name. Beatrice read it twice in the dim barn light, with the horses shifting around her, and Ethan working quietly nearby. 5 accounts. Documented dates, consistent methods, a clear pattern that no reasonable examiner could call coincidence. County records, the cross-reference transfers, the judges, the threats. She put the pages carefully back in the envelope. It was enough to begin, maybe enough to finish. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while she'd been in Fort Junction, Pruitt had been talking to Morrison, and Morrison had been deciding that waiting for the property inspection to play out was no longer his preferred approach. By the time Beatrice had the folder complete, and Ethan had written to a federal land court contact he'd found through Chet Briggs' brother-in-law in Denver, Morrison had already set the next move in motion. It arrived without warning on a gray Tuesday morning, which was 2 days after they got back from Fort Junction, and it didn't come to the house. It came to Ethan, out on the south pasture, where he was working alone. She was in the kitchen when she heard the shot. It was distant, not at the house, not close, but it was unmistakably a shot, and then 2 more in quick succession. She was out the door in less than a minute, moving toward the sound, and what she found at the edge of the south pasture stopped her cold. Ethan was on the ground. He'd been thrown from his horse, the animal was gone, spooked and run, and he was trying to push himself up with one arm and not managing it. He was conscious. She could see that from 20 yards, but there was blood on the side of his head and more on his left arm, dark and spreading against his coat, and he wasn't getting up. She crossed the ground between them at a run. Ethan. She was down on her knees beside him before she'd fully stopped moving. Look at me. Look at me. He looked at her. His eyes were tracking but unfocused, the particular look of a man who'd hit his head hard enough to knock the world sideways. There was a gash along his left temple, and the arm she got his coat open and saw the wound along the outer edge of his forearm. Deep and bleeding fast, but not an artery. She was almost certain. Not an artery. What hit you? She said, already tearing the hem of her shirt for pressure. Didn't see them, he said. His voice was thick, came from the ridge. 2 men, maybe. My horse. 'Tis gone, it doesn't matter. She pressed the cloth firm against his arm. I need you to hold this. Can you hold this? He got his right hand on it and pressed. She looked at the ridge line. Nothing moving. She looked back at Ethan. His face was pale and set, and he was breathing through his teeth, which was actually a good sign, meant he was managing the pain instead of being buried under it. We need to get you back to the house, she said. Can you walk? Think so. Then we're going to do it now, before whoever that was decides to come down for a closer look. She got him up. It took both of them working at it. He was heavy and dizzy, and the arm was making him careful about every movement, and she was strong, but not strong enough to carry him. He leaned on her shoulder, and she put her arm around his back, and they started moving, slowly and not gracefully, back across the field toward the house. It was a long 1/4 mile. She talked to him the whole way, not about anything in particular about the fence line, about what she'd need to do for his arm when they got inside, about Sophie at the Briggs place, about Hector's letter and Margaret's 3 pages. She talked because it kept him focused on her voice and kept him putting one foot in front of the other, and because the alternative was silence, and silence on that walk would have been the wrong kind. When she finally got him through the kitchen door and into a chair, she was out of breath, and her shoulder ached where his weight had been, and she was aware of her hand shaking slightly as she went for the medicine kit, not from fear. Or not only from fear, but from the particular physical release that comes when your body has been holding itself together against something, and finally gets a moment to acknowledge it. Cleaned his wounds. The head gash was bad-looking, but not deep. The arm wound was worse, long and ragged along the outside of the forearm. The kind that would scar. The kind that needed to be closed. She'd done this before, her aunt had taught her, and she did it now without apology for the pain it caused, because apologizing wouldn't help him, and the work needed to be done right. He sat in the chair and held still, and didn't make more noise than he had to, which was like him. When she was almost done, his eyes had cleared enough to be fully focused, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "You're not scared," he said. "I'm terrified," she said, pulling the last stitch through. "I'm just better at working scared than I am at standing still." He looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly, Beatrice. It was the first time he'd said her name. Not Mrs. Walker, not that carefully neutral, nothing he'd used in the early weeks. Her name. She heard the weight in it. "Don't say anything important right now," she said. "Your head isn't right yet. Say it when you're clear." Almost smiled. It was half a smile, the kind that pain edits before it gets all the way to the surface. "Okay," he said. She tied off the bandage and sat back and looked at him, pale and stitched and present, alive in the chair in the kitchen she'd come to know as well as the one she'd grown up in, and she thought about Morrison, so about what this meant. About the fact that Morrison had stopped waiting for legal mechanisms and had decided to solve his problem in the most direct way available to him. She thought about what came next, and she thought that whoever Morrison was, whatever reach he had in this county, he had made a serious mistake in underestimating what a woman was willing to do when the thing she was fighting for had finally, unexpectedly, become something she cared about losing. She didn't sleep that night. Ethan was in his bed by 8 o'clock, the wound cleaned and closed, and his head wrapped with enough bandaging that Sophie would have something alarming to look at when she came home. Beatrice had given him a tea with willow bark, and something her aunt had taught her to use for swelling, and he'd gone down fast the way people did when they'd spent their body's entire reserve on just staying upright. She checked on him twice in the first hour. His breathing was steady. The arm wasn't seeping through the bandage. She left the lamp turned low in the hall and went back to the kitchen. She sat at the table with the folder open in front of her and thought about what Morrison had done. He'd made a decision. That was the important thing to understand, not the violence of it, not the shock of it, but what it meant about where he was in his own thinking. A man who sends 2 men to shoot at someone on his own property has moved past the phase where he believes legal mechanisms are enough. He's made a calculation that direct force is now the more efficient path. That calculation only gets made when the legal mechanisms are starting to feel uncertain, which meant the folder was working. The records, the statements, the pattern she'd been building, he'd felt it. Pruitt had told him enough, and Morrison had looked at what Beatrice was assembling and decided he couldn't wait. That was almost good news. Almost, because it also meant he was dangerous in a different way now. A man who controlled a county judge and ran a fraudulent lending scheme for 6 years was one kind of threat. A man who'd decided to start shooting was another. The first kind you fought with paper and patience. The second kind you needed to be faster than. She pulled Hector's letter out, then Margaret's 3 pages, then Vera Caswell's sealed statement, then the copies she'd made of the county transfer records. She laid them out on the table in the order a federal examiner would need to read them, thinking about what was missing and what was solid enough to use, even if it wasn't perfect. What she needed was a way to get this to Denver before Morrison made his next move. Property inspection was scheduled in under 2 weeks. If he accelerated that, if he found a reason to call it sooner, the legal grounds would shift before the federal case had any traction. She needed someone who could carry the folder to Denver and put it directly into the right hands. Not a hired messenger, someone who understood what they were carrying and why it mattered. Someone who wouldn't be intercepted or discouraged or bought off on the road. She thought about Chet Briggs. His brother-in-law was the contact in Denver that Ethan had mentioned, a man Frank alderman who'd worked as a surveyor for the federal land office before going into private work. He knew the court structure. He'd know who to talk to. She wrote a letter to Frank Alderman that night, at the kitchen table, while the lamp burned down. She wrote it carefully and completely, the way her father had taught her to write anything important, as if the person reading it knew nothing about the situation and had no reason to care until you gave them one. She laid out the pattern. She cited the records by date and document number. She named Morrison, named Fitch, named the specific clause and its function. She explained what Vera Caswell had been told when she tried to challenge it. She kept the language flat and exact, because outrage never convinced anyone who didn't already agree with you. When she was done, she folded it into the envelope with the copied records and sealed it. She rode to Briggs' place before sunrise. Chet was already in his barn when she arrived, which she'd counted on. He was a man who kept farmers' hours and didn't sleep past 4, regardless of weather or circumstance. He came out when he heard her horse, saw it was her, and read something in her face that made him skip the greeting. "Ethan," he said. "He's alive," she said. "Someone shot at him on the south pasture yesterday afternoon. I need to get this to your brother-in-law in Denver." She held out the envelope. "Today, if there's a way." Briggs took the envelope and turned it in his hands. "Frank's in Denver as of last week. I had a letter from him. He could have this by Thursday if I send someone now. Can you?" "My youngest can ride," he said. "He's 18 and steady. I'll send him this morning." She exhaled slowly. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet." He looked at the envelope. "How bad is Ethan?" "He'll be on his feet in 2 days," she said. "The arm needs time, but he's not the type to wait for time." Briggs looked at her for a moment with the particular assessment of someone who's revising an opinion they thought was settled. "You know what you're doing," he said. It wasn't a question. "Most of the time," she said. "Not always." She rode back to find Ethan sitting at the kitchen table. He was pale, and the arm was held carefully, and he'd made coffee badly, she could tell, from across the room, that he'd put too much in and boiled it too long. But he was upright, and his eyes were clear, and he looked at her with an expression that said he'd been thinking while she was gone. "You went somewhere," he said. "Briggs," she said. "I sent the folder to Denver with his son." She hung her coat and poured herself some of the terrible coffee, because she needed something hot. "How's the arm?" "It hurts," he said. "Good," she said. "If it hurt less, I'd be worried about the nerves." She sat down across from him. "Morrison's going to move again. I don't know how long we have. I've been thinking about that," he said. He put both hands on the table, the bandaged arm moving carefully. "If he sends men back out here, we're not in a position to stop them by ourselves. Tom Riley isn't enough, and I can't do what I could do yesterday with this arm." "I know. So we need people," he said. "People who have reason to be on this property without it looking like a defensive position." She looked at him. "You're thinking about the other families." "Hector," he said. "Briggs. Maybe 1 or 2 others. Not a standoff, nothing that looks like a fight. Just men who'd be here, working, visible. Morrison won't move on a property full of witnesses. Not when he's already trying to keep the violence quiet. Good instinct. Not a perfect plan, but a good instinct, which was what the situation called for. Can you ask them today? I can ride, he said. You were shot at yesterday. I know, he said, and if I stay in this kitchen, Morrison wins without even sending anyone back. He picked up his coffee cup with his right hand. I'll take it slow. She wanted to argue. She also knew he was right, and she'd found early in this marriage that arguing against a right position was its own kind of waste. Take Tom with you, she said. Don't go anywhere by yourself until this is over. Done. he said. She went to collect Sophie from the Briggs place that afternoon, because keeping her away any longer would alarm the girl more than bringing her home. Ruth Briggs had kept her well. Sophie came out of the farmhouse with hay in her hair, and the slightly dazed look of a child who'd spent 2 days doing something she'd actually enjoyed, which, in this case, was the foal, who was apparently the most interesting creature Sophie had encountered in her 10 years. She talked about the foal the entire ride home. Beatrice listened and responded where responses were needed, and let the girl run, because it was good to hear her talk freely about something that had nothing to do with any of the things pressing on the adults around her. When they got back to the ranch, and Sophie saw Ethan's bandaged arm, she went very still. "Papa," she said. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not fine, you're wrapped up." "Wrapped up and fine are not mutually exclusive," he said. Soph looked at Beatrice. In the weeks since the wedding, the girl had developed a habit of looking at Beatrice when she wanted the true version of something her father had edited for her comfort. Beatrice had noticed this without mentioning it, because noticing it would embarrass Ethan, and there was no benefit in that. "He took a fall," Beatrice said. "The arm needed a few stitches. He's going to be careful with it, and it'll heal up." Sophie looked between them both. She was working out how much of this was true and how much was managed. 10-year-olds who'd lost a parent had a finely calibrated detector for when adults were trying to protect them from something real. "Are we in trouble?" Sophie said. Ethan opened his mouth. "Yes," Beatrice said before he could answer. "We're handling it. You don't need to worry about it, but I'm not going to tell you things are fine when they're complicated." Sophie absorbed that. She looked at her father and then back at Beatrice. Then she went to her room without another word, which was not a storm-off. It was the girl going away to think, which was how she processed things. Ethan watched her go and looked at Beatrice with an expression that mixed relief and something else she couldn't fully name. "Thank you for that," he said quietly. "She'd have known anyway," Beatrice said. "I know, I just." He paused. "Clara always said I was too eager to smooth things over." It was the first time he'd mentioned Clara in a way that wasn't weighted with grief closing off the sentence. Just a plain statement, his wife's voice in it. Beatrice received it the way you receive something that's been kept a long time carefully, without making too much of it. "She wasn't wrong," Beatrice said, "but you're getting better at it." He looked at her. A long look, not searching exactly, more like arriving at something. He opened his mouth, and she thought for a moment he was going to say something that would change the tenor of things between them. Then the sound of hooves in the yard interrupted him, and both of them moved to the window. 3 horses. Hector Ruiz was one of the riders. The other 2 were men she didn't recognize, but Ethan did. She saw it in how his shoulders changed. "Gus Fontaine and Del Marsh," he said. "They ranched together south of Halverson's place. Morrison restructured their debt 18 months ago. They're here because Hector told them," she said. "Looks like it." She went to put the coffee on. Not the terrible version Ethan had made earlier. The real kind. The 5 of them sat around the kitchen table, Ethan, Beatrice, Hector, and the 2 men, and she laid out what they were dealing with in plain terms. Not to frighten them, not to recruit them into something foolish, just to let them see the full shape of it. Gus Fontaine was a compact, sunburned man with very little to say, but a quality of attention that told her he was processing everything she said at a level below the surface. Del Marsh asked questions. Good ones, specific, about timing and legal procedure, and what happened if Morrison moved before Denver responded. She answered every question honestly, including the ones where the honest answer was that she didn't know. "The risk to you is real," she told them. "Morrison has already shown he's willing to use force. If you're here on this property, you become visible, and that has consequences I can't fully predict." Gus looked at Del. Del looked at the table. Then he said, "He took our equipment last fall. Said we'd defaulted. We'd made every payment, every one." He said it quietly, without heat, which somehow made it worse. "We've been working hired labor since October. My wife's sister took in our kids for 2 months because we couldn't keep the stove going." He stopped. "We're in." Gus nodded once. Hector hadn't said anything. He looked at Beatrice. "You sent something to Denver." "This morning," she said. "How long before we hear back?" "Best case, a week," she said. "Worst case, the examiner isn't interested and we start over." Hector leaned back in his chair. "He'll be interested," he said. 9 documented transfers. Morrison's been sloppy about the pattern because nobody ever gathered it all together before. He looked at the folder on the table. "You gathered it." "We gathered it," she said. He shook his head slightly, in a way that wasn't disagreement, but acknowledgement of something she'd said that he found worth marking. The men stayed through supper. Beatrice cooked for all of them, a thing she did without ceremony, big pot. What was in the larder, enough for everyone. Sophie came out of her room and sat at the far end of the table and was quiet until Gus, who apparently had children of his own, started telling a story about a mule he'd once owned that had opinions about rain. Sophie laughed. It was a real laugh, the full kind, and Ethan heard it from across the table and looked at his daughter with an expression he didn't try to hide. Hector and the others slept in the barn. It was their choice. They were working men, and a barn was fine. The week that followed was the strangest stretch of days Beatrice had experienced since arriving at the Double W. The ranch had people on it in a way it hadn't in years. Hector and the 2 men moving through the daily work, alongside Ethan Tom Riley still there. Chet Briggs riding over twice to bring news from his son on the road to Denver. Place felt occupied in a way that changed its character. Less like a position being defended, and more like a working property with enough hands to function. Ethan's arm came along. He pushed it too fast, which she expected, and she said so, which he expected. And he backed off about 1/3 of the distance she'd asked for, which was more than she'd actually hoped for. The head wound was clean. No sign of fever, no headaches past the 2nd day. He was going to be fine. On the 5th day after she'd sent the folder, Morrison made his move. It didn't come with guns this time. It came with a document, delivered to the county courthouse in Ethan's name, announcing that the property inspection of the Double W had been rescheduled to the following Tuesday 6 days earlier than planned. The notice arrived via a county clerk who rode out to the ranch and looked profoundly uncomfortable about the task, which suggested he knew something was wrong with it, but wasn't in a position to say so. Ethan took the notice and read it twice and handed it to Beatrice. She read it once. "He's forcing our hand," she said. "What happens if we don't have something from Denver before Tuesday?" Ethan said, "The inspection results get submitted to the county assessor's office. Fitch can use them to order a debt reassessment within 48 hours of submission. Morrison will have the grounds to call the full original debt." She set the document on the table. "We'd have to pay in full or vacate, and we can't pay in full." "No." Ethan stood. He walked to the window, which was his habit, and looked at the yard where Hector was visible near the fence line, and beyond that the flat open land going gray under a November sky. "What do? We go to Silver Creek," she said. "Tomorrow. We talk to every person Morrison has dealt with, who we haven't talked to yet. If we can find one more account, someone in town who saw what Morrison did to the Halverson property, someone who witnessed his men taking equipment without proper documentation, we have a wider net. In one day." "In one day," she said. He turned from the window. "Then we go tomorrow." They left at 7 in the morning with Tom Riley, watching the ranch and Hector and the men still present. The ride into Silver Creek was quiet and fast, both of them on horseback, moving with the particular focus of people who've distilled a complicated situation down to what it actually requires. Their first stop was the feed merchant, a man named Gabe Tolliver, who'd been in Silver Creek for 20 years and had seen everything the town had been through. He was behind his counter when they walked in, and when Beatrice explained what she needed, he looked at her steadily for a long time. "I've been waiting," he said, "for 3 years, for someone to walk in here with that question." He'd witnessed Morrison's men removing equipment from the Halverson property. He'd seen the paperwork they carried, Or rather, he'd seen that they weren't showing paperwork to anyone who asked. He'd heard Tom Halverson come into the feed store 2 days later saying the bank had taken his thresher and his wagon on a default he didn't know he'd committed. Tolliver had told the story to anyone who'd listen, and nobody had done anything about it, because there was no mechanism to do anything about it in Silver Creek that Morrison didn't also control. He wrote it down for her in 20 minutes while she stood at the counter. His handwriting was large and clear and certain. They found 2 more people before noon. A woman named Edna Cartwright, who'd been a customer of the Silver Creek Savings and Loan before moving her accounts to Fort Junction, who'd seen the inside of Morrison's loan agreements and had recognized the clause. Beatrice described because she'd had a version of it in her own. She'd gotten out before Morrison could use it, moved her debt before the trap closed, but she knew exactly what she was describing. And a man named Peter Yount, who ran the livery stable, who had been present at the county assessor's office on the day Margaret Benton's challenge was filed and dismissed. He'd been there on unrelated business, but he'd seen Judge Fitch walk into that hearing already carrying a written decision, before a word of testimony had been heard. Beatrice wrote all of it into her notebook, sitting in the livery stable on an overturned bucket while Peter Yount talked, and Ethan stood near the door watching the street. 7 accounts now. Gabe's written statement, Edna's testimony about the clause, Peter's account of Fitch with the pre-written decision, all of it building on what she'd already sent to Denver, all of it adding shape and weight to a story that could no longer be explained as coincidence or individual bad luck. She was closing her notebook when Ethan said, "From the door, Beatrice." She looked up. His voice had changed. Something in it that made her move quickly to stand beside him and look where he was looking. Morrison was crossing the street toward the livery. He wasn't running. He never ran. That wasn't his style. He was walking the way he always walked, measured and certain, with 2 men behind him who were not the same 2 from the South Pasture, but had the same function. He'd seen them, or someone had told him they were in town. Either way, he was coming. "Stay here," Ethan said. "I'm not staying here," she said, Beatrice. "He came to us," she said. "That means he's the one who needs something. Let him come." She stepped out of the livery and stood in front of it. Ethan came and stood beside her. Morrison stopped about 10 feet away. He looked at the 2 of them, and then his eyes moved to Beatrice with the particular assessment of a man who's recalibrating a threat. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "I've been hearing your name in interesting places." "I imagine you have," she said. You've been asking questions," he said, "making visits, collecting paperwork." He let a pause sit there. "It's an ambitious undertaking for a rancher's wife." "I keep busy," she said. Morrison looked at Ethan. "I'm concerned about the direction things are heading, Ethan. I'd like to resolve this amicably. I'm a reasonable man. You know that. You sent men to shoot at him," Beatrice said. The street was not empty. 3 people on the boardwalk across the way. Gabe Tolliver had appeared in the doorway of the feed store. Peter Yount was still behind her in the livery, and she was certain he hadn't moved. Morrison's expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but something underneath it did. Slight adjustment. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said carefully. "Of course you don't," she said. "Just like you don't know that 5 people who lost their properties through your loan agreements have given written statements about how it happened, or that a federal land court examiner in Denver is currently reviewing documentation of 9 fraudulent loan transfers over 6 years, or that Judge Fitch's conflict of interest is now part of that documentation by name." The men behind Morrison had gone still. Morrison himself was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower. "You don't have anything that would hold up." "Maybe not," she said, "but the examiner in Denver is going to decide that, not you, and not Judge Fitch." Another pause. On the boardwalk across the street, one of the 3 people who'd been watching hadn't moved. A woman Beatrice didn't know was standing very still, watching. "I'll be at the Double W on Tuesday," Morrison said, "with the county inspector. Your loan agreement gives me that right." "We'll be ready for you," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. not with rage, with something colder than rage, the kind of look that was calculating rather than feeling. Then he turned and walked back the way he came, his men behind him. The street came back to life around them. Gabe Tolliver went inside. Peter Yount appeared at her shoulder. That was something, Peter said. She does that, Ethan said. He was looking at Morrison's back, getting smaller across the street. Then he looked at Beatrice. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were doing something else entirely. She looked at her notebook. We need to get home, she said. We have 4 days. They rode back in the early afternoon with a sky that had turned the color of old pewter, and a wind coming from the north that meant weather by nightfall. Beatrice spent the ride going through what she had and what she needed and what was outside her control, which was a significant portion of the picture. Frank Alderman in Denver had the folder. She didn't know if he'd looked at it yet, didn't know who he'd shown it to, didn't know if the federal examiner she'd addressed it toward was interested or available or inclined to take county land disputes seriously. Done what she could do. Now she needed the world to do its part. That was the hardest kind of waiting, the kind where you'd spent everything you had and had to trust that it was enough. When they got back, Sophie was at the table doing schoolwork. She looked up when they came in, read both their faces the way she'd gotten good at, and said nothing. She went back to her work. Hector was in the barn. The ranch looked exactly like itself, ordinary and occupied and real. Ethan put the horses up. Beatrice made supper. They ate. The 4 of them, Hector came in from the barn, and the meal was plain and substantial, and nobody talked about Tuesday. After Sophie was in bed, Beatrice sat at the table and wrote one more letter. This one to her Aunt Frances, telling her where things stood, asking her to keep her ear to the ground in town, asking her specifically to let her know if Morrison visited the county records office or the assessor's office before Tuesday. Ethan came back downstairs when she was sealing the envelope. He sat across from her and looked at the table between them for a moment. You stood in front of him today, he said. He wasn't going to do anything in the middle of the street, she said. You didn't know that for certain. No, she admitted. But he needed to know that we weren't afraid of him in public. If he thinks we're hiding, he gets to define the terms. If he sees us standing in the street in front of witnesses, that changes what he thinks he's dealing with. Ethan was quiet for a moment. When I was on the ground out there, he said on the south pasture. Couldn't get up, he stopped. Restarted. The first thing I thought about was Sophie, and then another pause, and then you. She looked at him across the table. That surprised me, he said. I want you to know that it surprised me. She held his gaze. I know this wasn't what you chose, she said quietly. This whole arrangement. I know you didn't pick this. I'm not talking about the arrangement, he said. The lamp between them was burning low and needed oil, but neither of them moved to fix it. Outside, the wind had come up the way she'd predicted, cold and steady against the walls of the house. Say it when you're sure, she said. Not pulling back, not deflecting, just giving him room to be certain. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached across the table, carefully, with his good hand, and covered hers where it rested on the envelope. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She turned her hand over and held his. The lamp burned down. The wind worked at the corners of the house. And somewhere in Denver, a folder full of truth was sitting on a desk, waiting for someone to open it. Tuesday was coming, and whatever it brought, the Double W was not going to meet it alone. The wind that had come up Sunday night didn't quit. It ran through Monday without stopping, cold and gritty, throwing dust against the windows and making the barn door bang on its hinges until Hector weighted it with a stone. Inside the house, the fire worked hard and the room stayed warm enough, but there was an edge to everything, the sound of the weather outside, the 4 days that had collapsed into one, the knowledge that Tuesday was no longer an abstraction. Beatrice woke before 4 on Monday morning and lay still for a few minutes listening to the wind and thinking about what the day required. Then she got up. She had not heard from Frank Alderman in Denver. Chet Briggs' son had confirmed delivery. The folder had arrived Thursday as expected. had been received by Alderman personally, and that was where the information stopped. Whether Alderman had acted on it, whether he'd gone to the federal court, whether the examiner had looked at a single page, she didn't know. She'd sent everything she had into a silence that hadn't answered back. That was the part she couldn't control, and she'd spent the better part of 4 days making her peace with it. Not successfully, entirely. You didn't make complete peace with something like that. You just decided to keep working anyway. She made coffee and sat with her notebook and went through the full account. One more time, not looking for things she'd missed, because she'd looked enough times now to be sure there was nothing new to find, but steady teasing herself with the shape of it. Pattern was real. It was documented. It was the kind of thing that, presented to the right person, could not be reasonably ignored. She had to trust that, not because trust was comfortable, but because it was all that was left. Ethan came down at 5. He looked at her over the coffee, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything about tomorrow, because everything that could be said had already been said. He poured his coffee and sat across from her and opened the accounts ledger and started going through numbers, which was what he did when he needed to feel like he was doing something. She understood that completely. She went back to her notebook. Sophie came down at 7 and ate breakfast and went to school, and when she left, she stopped in the doorway and looked at both of them. "I'll be home by 3, she said. "Good," Ethan said. Sophie hesitated. Then she came back and put her hand briefly on Beatrice's arm. Not quite a hug. Not quite. Not a hug. A 10-year-old's version of, "I know something is happening, and I'm acknowledging it without making you talk about it." Then she was out the door and gone. Ethan watched the door close. "She's a good kid," he said. "She is," Beatrice said. "She's a lot like you." He looked at her. "She's better than me." "She had better circumstances," Beatrice said. "She had someone who stayed." He was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, around the thing he wasn't yet fully ready to say, but was getting closer to, "You stayed." "I did," she said. He nodded and went back to the ledger. He reached across and moved his coffee cup closer to hers. And that was its own kind of sentence. Afternoon, Hector and the other men had done a quiet but deliberate piece of work. Without being asked to make it visible, they distributed themselves across the ranch in positions that covered the approaches, Gus near the north fence, Dell watching the east road, Hector himself near the barn, where he could see the main gate. It wasn't a military operation. They were just men doing ranch work in places where ranch work happened to provide a clear view of anyone coming. Ethan saw it and said nothing about it. He went and fixed the barn door properly instead of leaving it weighted with a stone, because the wind was supposed to break tonight and he'd need it working tomorrow. Tom Rayleigh brought news at 2 o'clock. He'd ridden in from town, and his horse was blowing him. "Morrison was at the assessor's office this morning," he said. He was talking to both of them, standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands. "Spent about an hour in there. Clerk I know said he brought new paperwork, an amended inspection scope." Tom paused. "It's not just a property inspection anymore." He added a clause about residential compliance review. Beatrice set down her cup. "He's invoking the residential arrangement clause." "What's that mean?" Tom said. "It means he's planning to argue tomorrow that the terms of the restructured loan have been violated," Ethan said. "Not just assess the property value claim. We're in default on the living arrangement condition." He looked at Beatrice. "Can he do that?" "He's going to try," she said. "The language in the clause is broad enough that he can frame almost anything as a violation, and if Fitch is the one deciding whether the framing is valid." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Tom looked between them. "What do you want me to do?" "Ride back to town," Beatrice said. "Go see my Aunt Frances. Tell her what Morrison added to the scope. She'll know who in town needs to hear it tonight." Tom put his hat back on and was out the door in under a minute. She stood at the window after he left and looked at the yard and thought about the residential arrangement clause, the buried language on page 4 that she'd found the morning after their wedding, the thing that had started all of this. Morrison had been patient with it for weeks, keeping it in reserve, and now he was pulling it out, because he decided that the direct approach to the shooting, the accelerated inspection, wasn't going to be enough. He needed a legal mechanism that Fitch could validate, something that looked official and gave him grounds that didn't require explaining a man who'd gotten shot on his own land. He still thought this was about paperwork. He still thought he was the only one in this county who knew how to use it. She went to the shelf and took down the folder. She read through the residential arrangement clause one more time and thought about every piece of the case she'd built around it. Then she thought about what she had that Morrison didn't. She thought about what a federal examiner could do that Judge Fitch couldn't stop. Thought about Frank Alderman in Denver, who had the folder and hadn't answered. She went to bed at 9 o'clock because tomorrow required her to be rested, and lying awake until 2 in the morning wouldn't change what was coming. Ethan was still at the table when she went upstairs. She stopped at the bottom step. "Come to bed," she said. "Not because I'm asking you to, because you need to sleep." He looked up from the ledger. A long pause. Then he closed it. "Yeah," he said. All right, he came upstairs, and for the first time since the wedding, the house felt like a single thing. Tuesday arrived, with a sky that had cleared in the night, washed clean by the wind, the kind of cold, clear morning that looked almost cheerful from inside and was brutal the moment you stepped out. Beatrice was up at 5 again. She dressed carefully, not her work clothes, not what she wore to pull pumps or fix harness. Her dark green dress, the one she'd made herself, the one she'd worn at the county office on the day of the wedding, fit her the same as it always had. She stood in front of the small mirror and looked at herself without flinching, which was a practice she'd developed early in life as a defense against a world that was always ready to flinch for her. She looked like what she was. That was enough. She went downstairs and made breakfast for everyone: Ethan, Hector, Gus, Del, Tom when he arrived at 7, and the kitchen was full in a way it hadn't been since she'd arrived. 6 adults around and near a table built for 4. Nobody complained about the space. There was something in the room that wasn't quite confidence but was adjacent to it. The kind of collective stillness that settles over people who have decided to do a thing together and stopped second-guessing it. Sophie came downstairs at 7:30 in her school dress and stopped in the kitchen doorway at the sight of all the people. "All here," she said. "Good morning to you too," Hector said. Sophie looked at Beatrice. "Is today the day?" "Yes," Beatrice said. Sophie sat down at the table where Gus made room for her, and she ate her eggs without being asked, and didn't say she was scared, though Beatrice could see that she was in the way children carried fear, not on the surface, but in the extra stillness, the slightly too careful movements. "You'll go to school," Ethan said to her. "Normal as any day." Sophie opened her mouth. "Normal as any day," he said again, more gently. "Whatever happens here, it'll be done before you're home. And someone will come to the school to get you if there's anything you need to know before 3 o'clock. Sophie looked at Beatrice one more time. Beatrice looked back at her steadily. "We have everything we need," she said to the girl. "Go to school." Sophie went. Morrison arrived at 10 o'clock exactly, which was precise in a way that was its own statement. He came with the county inspector, a man named Howarth, thin and officious, with a ledger under his arm, and 2 of his men, and behind them, to Beatrice's careful attention, a man she didn't recognize. He was older, somewhere near 60, dressed well but not elaborately, with a traveling bag that said he hadn't come from town. He'd come from farther. They all came through the main gate on horseback and stopped in the yard, where Ethan stood with Hector at his shoulder and Tom Riley off to one side. Beatrice stood in the doorway of the house. Morrison took in the number of people present with a controlled expression, expected them to be alone, or close to it. He looked at Hector and at the other men positioned around the property, and then he looked at Beatrice in the doorway, and the calculation running behind his eyes was visible for just a moment before he smoothed it over. "Walker," he said by way of greeting. "Morrison," Ethan said. County Inspector was already pulling out his ledger with the air of a man who wanted to get through this as quickly as possible and go home. "I'm here to conduct the amended property inspection, per the order filed with the county assessor." Mr. Howarth, Beatrice said from the doorway. Howarth looked up. Before you begin, she said, I'd like to know whether you're aware that the amended inspection scope you're carrying was filed using a loan clause that is currently under federal review for fraudulent construction. Howarth blinked. I'm not. I conduct inspections per the orders I receive. I know you do, she said. I'm not suggesting you knew. I'm telling you now, before you put your name on anything, so that you have the information. The man who'd arrived with Morrison, but wasn't one of his men, was watching Beatrice from his horse an expression of focused attention. She noticed him again. He hadn't moved or said anything since they'd arrived. Morrison stepped forward. This is a legally filed inspection, and it will proceed. It may proceed, she said calmly. I'm not stopping it. I'm informing everyone present of the context. She looked at Morrison directly. I'm also informing everyone present that I've received a letter this morning from a federal land court examiner in Denver named Thomas Reardon, who has reviewed documentation of 9 fraudulent loan transfers in this county carried out by Silver Creek Savings and Loan over the past 6 years. Examiner Reardon has opened a formal inquiry. The yard was very quiet. She pulled the letter from the pocket of her dress. She'd read it 4 times since it arrived by courier at 7 that morning, an hour before Morrison. She held it up, not waving it, just visible, present, real. The inquiry specifically names the residential arrangement clause in standard Morrison restructuring agreements as a fraudulent mechanism designed to manufacture default conditions, regardless of borrower compliance. Morrison's face had gone through 2 or 3 things quickly and landed on something that was trying to be composed. A letter from a federal examiner, he said, written on the basis of whatever you've been cobbling together and sending around the territory, written on the basis of documented evidence from 7 individuals whose properties were taken through the same mechanism you're attempting to invoke today, she said, including payment receipts that contradict your bank's default notices, including a signed account from a witness who watched Judge Fitch enter a hearing against Margaret Benton carrying a pre-written dismissal. She paused. Examiner Reardon has forwarded his preliminary findings to the circuit court in Denver. Judge Fitch has been notified that his decisions in the relevant cases are under review. The man on horseback who'd traveled with Morrison spoke for the first time. His voice was unhurried and carried easily in the cold air. Harold, I think we should talk. Morrison turned. Something shifted in his posture, a subtle thing, but Beatrice saw it. The man wasn't one of his. The man was something else. Who are you? Ethan said. The man got down from his horse with the deliberateness of someone who was accustomed to rooms going quiet when he entered them. My name is Arthur Crane, he said. I'm a bank examiner from the Federal Reserve Office in Denver. I've been traveling through this territory for the past 3 weeks looking at several county-level lending institutions. He reached into his coat and produced a document of his own. The material forwarded by Examiner Reardon crossed my desk Friday. I arrived in Silver Creek yesterday evening. He looked at Morrison. I'd been planning to pay you a visit at the bank this afternoon, but it seems you've saved me the trip. The 2 men who'd come with Morrison had gone very still. Howarth, the inspector, was holding his ledger against his chest like it might protect him. Morrison looked at Crane, and for the first time in the weeks since he'd walked into the Double W's kitchen and told Ethan Walker he had 48 hours, Harold Morrison looked like a man who'd run out of room. Inspection, he started. Can be postponed, Crane said. Given the circumstances, he looked at Howarth. I'd suggest you postpone it. Howarth postponed it so fast the words almost ran together. What happened in the next hour was not dramatic in the way that some reckonings are dramatic. There was no shouting, no drawn weapons, no moment where Morrison broke down and confessed everything. He was too controlled for that, and the law was too procedural. What happened was that Arthur Crane asked to use the Walker kitchen table, which Beatrice provided, and he sat down with Morrison and with the documents Morrison had brought, and he went through them with the same methodical attention she'd given to the county ledgers. Morrison's men stayed in the yard. Hector stayed near the barn. Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway with his good arm resting on the frame and his bandaged arm held carefully at his side. Beatrice sat at the table with Crane and answered his questions when he had them. He had many questions. He asked them without heat or judgment, the way a doctor asks about symptoms, because the information mattered, not because he was trying to catch anyone. She answered all of them. She produced the copies she'd kept of every document she'd sent to Denver, because she'd made 2 sets of everything. Her father's voice in her head, always keep a copy. She put Hector's letter on the table, and Margaret's 3 pages, and Vera Caswell's statement, and Gabe Tolliver's written account, and Peter Yount's description of the pre-written dismissal. Crane read everything. He was a reader, in the way she was a reader, thorough, unhurried, going back to check things against each other. Morrison sat across the table through all of it, with his hands flat on the wood, and his expression carefully managed, and she watched him sitting there and thought about all the people who'd sat across from him in worse positions with less. The Halverson family, the Benton widow and her 2 kids, Vera Caswell, 20-something years old with a brother to support and a challenge she'd had to withdraw, Hector Ruiz, who'd spent 3 years thinking it was his own fault. She thought, this is what it costs when nobody gathers the evidence. When everyone believes they're alone in it, she thought, that's the thing Morrison counted on. Not legal sophistication, not judicial control, though that helped. He counted on isolation. He counted on the fact that people who've been beaten down don't talk to each other about how they were beaten. They go away and carry it privately. The way her father had, the way Hector had, the way all of them had convinced that the failure was personal rather than constructed. He'd been right about that for 6 years. He'd just finally been wrong about one person. Crane finished reading at 11:30. He closed the folder and looked at Morrison. I'm going to need you to come with me to the bank, he said, and I'm going to need access to your loan records. All of them, not just the ones in current use. Morrison looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Crane with the last remnant of a man trying to find an exit. You're talking about a federal investigation based on one woman's paperwork collection. I'm talking about a federal investigation based on documented evidence from 7 witnesses, county transfer records, payment receipts that contradict your bank's default filings, and a clause structure consistent across 12 loan agreements that was clearly designed to manufacture grounds for default. Crane's tone didn't change. It's not about the woman. It's about what she found. Morrison stood. He straightened his coat. He looked once more at Beatrice across the table, and what was in that look was not quite hatred. It was something colder and more honest than hatred. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who'd spent years operating in the belief a certain kind of person wasn't worth worrying about. Looking at the evidence that he'd been wrong, he walked out of the kitchen. Crane stood too and picked up the folder. He looked at Beatrice. I'll need your originals for the federal record, he said. I can provide you with certified copies in return. That's fine, she said. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was harder to read than his professional manner. Yo, built a solid case, he said. Better organized than what I usually see from legal professionals, frankly. My father taught me to read contracts, she said. Crane picked up his hat. Your father taught you right. He went outside. Through the kitchen window, she watched him walk to Morrison and say something low, and Morrison's 2 men looked at each other, and then the whole group of them, Morrison, Crane. The inspector, who'd already edged toward his horse, began to move toward the main gate. Not running, but moving with the particular purposefulness of people who've accepted that the situation has changed. Ethan came and stood beside her at the window. They watched Morrison ride out through the gate. He didn't look back. Ethan exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that carries more than just air. Hector appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at both of them, and then out the window, and then back at Beatrice. Is it done? The bank examination is starting, she said, which means Morrison's ability to act on any of those loan agreements is suspended pending investigation. Double W's debt restructuring will be reviewed. Depending on what Crane finds in the full records, several of those transfers could be reversed or renegotiated. Several, Hector said. I can't promise all of them, she said. I can tell you that what was hidden is not hidden anymore, and that changes what's possible. She paused. For everyone. Hector stood in the doorway for another moment. He wasn't a man who showed things easily in his face, but something was moving underneath. He nodded once, the kind of nod that meant more than agreement. That meant something had been set down that a person had been carrying for a long time. And then he went back outside. Gus and Dell were told the news by Ethan, who walked out to them and said it plain. She watched through the window. Dell sat down on the fence rail and put his head in his hands for a moment. Not grief relief, which sometimes looked the same from the outside. Gus stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the ground and then at the sky and then at Ethan and said something she couldn't hear. She went and started making coffee because it was the practical thing to do, and because her hands needed something to do while the rest of her caught up to what had just happened. There is a particular thing that happens to a person when a fight is over. Not immediately. There's still the momentum of it, the body still braced for the next thing. But a few minutes in, when the yard is clearing, and the voices outside are settling into ordinary conversation, and the coffee is starting to smell right, you start to come down from the altitude of it. And coming down from that altitude, after weeks of climbing, is its own kind of hard. Not bad, just unsteady. The way your legs feel after you've been holding a difficult position too long and finally get to straighten up. She was standing at the stove when she heard Sophie. Not at 3 o'clock, not with a calm walk home from school. 12:15, running. The sound of her boots on the porch unmistakable, and then the door opened, and Sophie with her coat half off, and her cheeks red from running, and her eyes going immediately to Beatrice, and then to Ethan, who'd come in from outside. Someone came to the school, Sophie said, breathing hard. Mr. Briggs's son. He said. It was okay. She looked at her father. Is it okay? It's okay, Ethan said. Sophie looked at Beatrice. She needed to hear it twice, from both sources, the way children needed confirmation from more than one direction when the thing at stake was large enough. It's okay, Beatrice said. Sophie crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and put her arms around Beatrice's waist and held on. She was a 10-year-old girl who'd lost her mother and spent the last several weeks watching the adults in her life carry something heavy without being allowed to help, and she held on with the full strength of all of that, her face pressed against Beatrice's front, not saying a word. Beatrice put her arms around the girl. She held her. She didn't say everything is fine, because fine was a small word for what this was. She didn't say I love you, because it was too soon to make that simple, and she didn't want to make it simple. She just held her and let the girl hold on for as long as she needed to. Ethan stood near the door and watched his daughter and his wife in the kitchen of his family's ranch. And whatever he felt in that moment was large enough that he didn't try to put a name to it. He just stood there and let it be what it was. Sophie finally loosened her grip. She stepped back and wiped her eyes with her sleeve, which she did quickly and without drawing attention to it, the way she'd learned from her father. She looked at Beatrice's face and then down at the floor. I drew another picture, she said, last night. I was going to wait and show you, but... She pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket. It had been folded hastily, a little crumpled at the edges. She held it out. Beatrice took it and opened it. It was the 3 figures again, the tall one, the medium one, the small one. But this time they weren't standing in front of the house separately. They were standing together, the medium figure's hand on the small one's shoulder, the tall one, close enough that the edges of all 3 figures touched. Sophie had written something at the bottom in her careful school hand, our ranch. Not my ranch. Not Papa's ranch, ours. Beatrice looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it in her dress pocket, against her chest, where the letter from Examiner Reardon had been. Thank you, she said to Sophie. Sophie shrugged, which was how she accepted things that mattered too much to respond to directly. "Are we eating lunch?" she said. "I ran all the way here and I'm hungry." Ethan laughed. It was a full, unguarded laugh, the kind she hadn't heard from him before, and it changed the room entirely. They ate lunch, the three of them at the kitchen table, with Hector coming in partway through, and Dell and Gus eating outside in the cold by choice because the kitchen was full enough. Tom Riley left before noon to get back to his own work, shaking Beatrice's hand at the door with a firmness that said more than whatever he managed to say with words. The afternoon went by in the way afternoons go after something large, has happened slowly and with an odd lightness. Things that needed doing got done, because the ranch didn't stop requiring things just because you'd been through something. Ethan worked the barn with his good arm and didn't complain about the bad one. Hector stayed through the afternoon because leaving felt too soon, and because the Double W's fence needed attention along the east line, and he knew how to fix fence. Beatrice sat with her notebook at the kitchen table and wrote out a complete account of everything that had happened since the folder went to Denver, while it was still clear in her mind. Not for herself, for Margaret Benton, and for Vera Caswell, and for Hector, so that they'd know exactly what had been submitted and what Arthur Crane had said and what the federal examination was going to look at. They deserved to know. She dragged them into this with her, and they deserved the full picture of what that had turned into. She wrote Hector's account separately because his situation with the Caldwell spread might change now, and it was worth documenting for him what the examination might mean for the recovery of his former property. She wasn't making promises. She was just giving him the map. Posted the letters before supper. When she came back to the ranch as the light was going, Ethan was sitting on the porch step. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting, which was unusual enough that she stopped when she saw him. She sat beside him on the step. The evening air was cold, but not brutal, the kind of cold that felt honest rather than hostile. The sky to the west was doing what western skies did at this time of year, turning colors that had no reliable names, going from gray to orange, to something between them that lasted about 4 minutes before the dark came. The land stretched out flat and wide and serious in every direction. They sat with the cold and the color and the quiet for a while. "My father built this place in 1858, Ethan said. "He and my mother." She drove the stakes for the first fence herself because he was still clearing the ground. He paused. "She died before I was 10. He never talked about her much. Kept those stakes. Had them in a box in the barn. When he died, I put them in the same box." Beatrice listened. "I used to think the ranch was what mattered," he said. "The land, the deed, the cattle. That's what I was trying to hold on to. When Clara got sick, I thought if I can just keep the ranch, keep things the same, then at least one thing survived." He looked at the horizon. "Morrison almost got the ranch, and I almost lost everything else trying to keep it." She thought about what to say. She chose what was true rather than what was comforting, because he'd earned that. And so had she. "The ranch matters," she said. "That's not wrong. Your father built it, and your daughter will grow up in it, and it's real, and it matters that it stays." She paused. "But you didn't keep it because you held on to it. You kept it because you let someone else help you hold on to it. Different thing." He looked at her sideways. "You're going to make that hard to argue with." "I know," she said. Color was leaving the sky. In the barn, she could hear Hector finishing up with the horses. Sophie was inside somewhere, probably at the table with her homework, maybe drawing again. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something for a while," Ethan said. "I know," she said again. "I'm not good at it. I never have been. Clarice used to." He stopped, and she waited, and he restarted without the hesitation this time. "Clara used to finish my sentences for me. Not because I couldn't think of the words, because she already knew what they were." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if you know mine yet. We haven't had that kind of time." But I think he stopped again, not struggling this time, but deliberate. "I think I want to have it that time." And I think what I feel now is not what I expected to feel, and I think it's real. And I'm not going to wait until I've found the perfect way to say it, because I've been waiting 3 weeks already, and I'm done waiting." She turned and looked at him. His face in the last of the light was not the face she'd first seen at the county office. Closed and grieving, and somewhere else entirely. It was the same face, same lines, same jaw, same eyes, but present here, looking at her. "I know," she said quietly. And then, because he needed to hear it and she needed to say it, "I feel it too." He reached for her hand, the same way he had at the kitchen table 2 nights ago, not urgently, not dramatically. Just reaching for it, because it was there, and he'd decided it was where his hand wanted to be. She gave it to him. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, a small motion, the kind that didn't announce anything, but said everything about the habit it intended to become. They sat on the porch step until the cold drove them inside. The weeks that followed were not a resolution in the storybook sense. They were not clean, or sudden, or tied with anything resembling a bow. Arthur Crane's examination of Silver Creek Savings and Loan took most of November. What he found in the full records was worse than what Beatrice had documented, in the specific way that hidden things are always worse once you have access to the whole of them. 14 fraudulent transfers rather than 9. 3 additional cases where Morrison had used the residential arrangement clause directly, including one where the borrower had paid every installment on time. The method was even more deliberate and systematic than she'd been able to prove from the outside. Morrison's bank was placed under federal receivership in the last week of November. He was informed that he would face federal charges related to fraudulent lending practices. His personal holding company, which held the 11 properties transferred to him through the scheme, was frozen pending investigation. Hector Ruiz's former property was among them. Judge Fitch was referred to a judicial review board. He resigned before the review completed. 3 of the 12 transfers were eventually returned to their original owners or their families through a negotiated settlement process that took over a year and was not simple or fair or without cost. Hector got his land back, not all of it, but enough. Margaret Benton received a settlement that covered a portion of what she'd lost, which she used to buy the boarding house outright. Vera Caswell was granted a debt cancellation on the original loan and a formal letter of apology from the federal receiver, which she framed and hung on her kitchen wall, not out of sentiment, but because it was evidence, and evidence was the kind of thing worth keeping visible. The Double W's restructured loan was invalidated entirely, which meant the original debt remained but at its original terms, without Morrison's manufactured interest, and with a federal note attached to the file that significantly complicated anyone's future ability to call it fraudulently. Ethan spent the next year working it down the honest way, which was slow and sometimes discouraging, and exactly what he'd always been willing to do if the terms had been straight from the beginning. Beatrice helped him, not by managing things for him, by working alongside him, which was different, and which suited them both better. The town of Silver Creek took time to process what had happened. Small towns always do. There was a period of embarrassment, the particular social discomfort of a community that has tolerated something bad for a long time looking at itself in the mirror. Some people who'd laughed at Beatrice Walker at the beginning of that marriage did not know how to look at her in the months after. She didn't make it easy for them, but she didn't make it hard either. She had no interest in being gracious about cruelty, but she had equally little interest in nursing the account. She was busy. She had a ranch to help build, and a husband whose arm healed crooked at the elbow and still gave him trouble in cold weather, and a daughter who was growing faster than either of them could track. Sophie turned 11 in January. She asked for a horse of her own, specifically a young one. She could work with herself and got a gray and white mare that had come off the Caldwell spread and needed patience rather than force. 2 of them, girl and horse, took to each other immediately, which told Beatrice something about Sophie's character that she'd already suspected. The child had her mother's instinct for what something needed, and her father's refusal to give up on it. She also had, Beatrice noticed, a growing habit of sitting in the kitchen when Beatrice was working there and asking questions. Not always the questions that seemed to be on the surface, not just, how do you do that, or what does that mean, but the underneath ones, the kind that were really asking something about the shape of a life and how a person decided to live it. What was it like before you came here? Did you always know what you wanted to do? Were you ever afraid of something and did it anyway? Beatrice answered them straight. She didn't talk down to Sophie, and she didn't overcomplicate. And she noticed that Sophie was doing something with the answers that wasn't just storing them. She was measuring them against something, working out her own position. One evening in February, when Ethan was outside and the kitchen was quiet, Sophie looked up from her homework and said, "Were you afraid?" When Morrison came to the yard. "Were you scared?" "Yes," Beatrice said. "You didn't look it. Looking scared wouldn't have helped anything," Beatrice said. "I didn't." She paused. Being scared and acting scared are two different things. You can be scared the whole time and still do what needs doing. Sophie considered that. Is that what brave is? Just doing it, even if you're scared? Partly, Beatrice said. The other part is deciding that the thing you're afraid of losing is worth the fear. She set down the cup she was drying. When you find something worth being afraid for, you'll understand the rest automatically. Sophie looked at her for a long moment. Then she went back to her homework without saying anything more. But the silence had a different quality in it. Now the quality of something being held carefully, turned over, kept. There is a thing people say about unlikely pairings, that love comes from unexpected places, that what you need finds you when you stop looking for it. These are the kinds of statements that are true enough to become cliches, and therefore lose all their weight. The real version is less graceful and more human than that. The real version is that two people who were forced together by debt and desperation, and one small-town banker's greed, spent several months being careful with each other across a kitchen table, and then less careful, and then honest, and then something that had no good name yet, but felt solid when they stood in it. The real version is that it wasn't love at first sight or slow-building warmth, or any of the things stories usually reach for. It was two people deciding, repeatedly and without fanfare, to keep showing up for the same life. And eventually the life became something neither of them had planned for, and both of them needed. By spring, the Double W was running better than it had in 3 years. Cattle were up. The fences were sound. Pump they'd fixed together in the first week of her marriage was still running, which Beatrice pointed out to Ethan one morning in April, and which made him smile in the way he smiled now, fully, without editing it. She was in the yard one afternoon in late April, looking at the kitchen garden she'd put in along the east wall of the house, thinking about what needed doing and in what order, when she became aware of Ethan standing a few feet behind her. She hadn't heard him come out, but she'd gotten used to being aware of where he was without having to look. "You're staring at the dirt," he said. "I'm thinking about the dirt," she said. Difference. He came and stood beside her. He looked at the garden plot, which was still mostly soil and potential at this point. A few early shoots of what would become parsley, and something else she'd started from her aunt's seeds. "What are you thinking about it?" he said. "Drainage," she said. "The southwest corner is going to sit wet in a heavy rain. I need to work the soil differently there." He crouched down and looked at the corner in question. "You could build it up a little," he said. 2-3 inches. Let the water run to the fence line." "That's what I was thinking," she said. He stood back up. He looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her lately, not like a man solving a problem, but like a man who stopped needing to. He picked up her hand from where it hung at her side and held it without saying anything, and they stood there in the April sun, looking at the garden that would be a garden, in a few months, on the land that had almost been taken, beside the house that had become home, in a way she hadn't let herself expect. She thought about her father, about the contract he hadn't known how to read, and the land that had slipped through his hands, and the way he'd spent 20 years sorry for it. She thought about what he'd given her instead. Every word, every clause, every boring paragraph that had turned out to matter. She hoped he'd known, wherever he'd ended up, that the gift had found its use. She thought about Hector Ruiz riding home to land he'd thought he'd lost for good. About Sophie's drawing still folded in the pocket of the dress hanging in her wardrobe. About Margaret Benton, who'd come back to the town that had failed her and made something out of the remaining pieces with the particular stubbornness of a woman who'd decided that leaving was too easy. She thought about what it meant to be underestimated. Not the insult of it, that was small and barely worth the energy, but the practical truth of it. That when the world looks at you and sees less than you are, it leaves you alone in ways that turn out to be useful. Nobody watched what she was doing. Nobody thought she was worth watching. Morrison had spent 6 years building a system that depended on people being too isolated and too beaten down to connect their experiences into a pattern, and he'd never considered that the person who would eventually do it might be someone he'd already written off the moment he saw her. She hadn't set out to be anyone's answer to anything. She'd set out to keep a ranch that had become her home from being taken by a man who believed he could take whatever he wanted. The rest of it had followed naturally from that, the way most important things followed from one person deciding to pay attention when everyone else had decided to look away. Pay attention. Keep records. Show up for the people who are fighting the same fight even when they don't know anyone else is fighting it. Don't let the size of a thing convince you you're not the right person to do something about it. Her father had taught her all of that by accident, in the space between what he'd lost and what he'd given her to replace it. It had been enough. It had, in the end, been more than enough. Then squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. The garden was going to need work before it was ready. The east fence still had 2 posts that wanted replacing. There were accounts to settle, neighbors to check on, a daughter's horse to help with in the mornings before school. There was, in other words, a life. Ordinary and specific, and hers in a way she hadn't had a life be hers before. Not perfect. The elbow still ached when it was cold, and some mornings the grief of old things showed on Ethan's face before he'd had his coffee, and Sophie had a temper when she was tired that she hadn't learned to manage yet, and that was going to take time. But it was real, and real she had long ago decided was worth more than any version of better that required you to pretend. She looked at the garden. She thought about what it would be in July, when the growing season was full and the light came long, and the ranch smelled like cut grass and warm earth. She decided it was going to be good,